Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. In this video, I want to share the fabulous books that I read for Asian Readathon 2022. Asian Readathon takes place every May and is hosted by withcindy here on YouTube. And it is of course in May because May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. This is the first year that I have participated in Asian Readathon, and I really enjoyed it. So I will post a link below to withcindy and specifically to the video introducing this year's readathon, which came with a number of prompts, which I will go through and share the books I chose for each. So this year the prompts are inspired by the new film Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I admittedly have yet to see, but I'm really looking forward to. It is definitely in the kind of sci-fi fantasy genre that you all know that I love so much, so I am looking forward to that. There were 5 prompts for the readathon, and one was allowed to combine the prompts, so you didn't necessarily have to pick 5 books for the prompts. You could, for example, pick a book that satisfied 2 prompts or 3 prompts and read fewer books while still completing all the prompts that way. The twist to the 5 prompts, though, is that however many books that you chose, the idea is that each book chosen would feature a character and or author of a different Asian ethnicity to encourage reading diversely within the readathon. So since there were 5 prompts, I went ahead and picked 5 books, and they are indeed 5 books by 5 different authors, all of whom are of Asian descent and of a different ethnicity. So I went for 1 book per prompt, though I will say a number of the books that I chose do satisfy multiple prompts, so they could have been put in a different order, if that makes sense. You'll see what I mean when I go through them. Anyway, without further ado, the 5 prompts for this year's Asian Readathon were: number 1, read a book written by an Asian author. All 5 of the books that I chose satisfy this prompt. Prompt number 2 is read a book featuring an Asian character who is a woman and or older. All of the books that I chose actually would satisfy this prompt as well. Prompt number 3 is to read a book by an Asian author that has a universe that you would want to experience, or a universe that is totally different from yours. This is of course inspired because the film Everything Everywhere All at Once deals with alternate and parallel universes. Prompt number 4 is to read a book by an Asian author that has a cover worthy of googly eyes. The film posters and promotional materials had googly eyes on them, or have googly eyes on them. So this is to read a book with a cover that is eye-catching or beautiful, or something special about it, I think. And then the final prompt is to read a book by an Asian author that has a high rating or is highly recommended. So again, I have picked 5 books. They could have gone in quite a different order than I've got them here. I just put 1 per prompt for the sake of making this video, honestly. So to read a book written by an Asian author. For this prompt, I will talk a little bit about the novel Kakei by Vaishnavi Patel. Now, Vaishnavi Patel is an Indian American author who in her website bio describes her work as writing at the intersection of Indian myth, feminism, and anti-colonialism. Kakei is based to a large extent, really, on the Sanskrit epic Ramayana. I am not very familiar with the Ramayana, I will just say right at the beginning of the review. I cannot really speak to Kakei as a novel in relationship to the Ramayana, its representation of the content of the Ramayana, and so this is just not an area that I can speak to. I encourage folks to read reviews by readers who can speak to the source material in a much more informed way than I could ever presume to do. But Kakei is a debut novel, and it was a fantastic debut novel, I thought. A fantasy novel. It's an epic novel that spans a number of decades, and it includes a lot of what I look for in what I would say is a epic novel. There's a lot of political maneuvering, complex political maneuvering and strategizing, combined with forms of magic that are compelling, combined with complex interpersonal relationships and power relationships between family members and different groups within the book. There's also what I thought was nuanced and respectful asexual representation with respect to the protagonist, the first person narrator protagonist, Kaki. And so that's what I liked about this novel, and so I definitely would recommend checking it out. The second prompt was to read a book featuring an Asian character, who is a woman and or older. And again, every book I read would satisfy this prompt. I read a lot of women-centric books for this readathon, but for this one, I chose to discuss a book that had been on my to-read list since before it came out. It just came out last year, and finally I got to get around to it this month, and that is Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki, who is a Japanese-American author. And this is a book that follows three different perspectives, three different protagonists, all of whom are women, and some of whom are older. So in terms of the prompt being a character who is a woman and or older, actually both are satisfied by Light from Uncommon Stars. And it's a really interesting one. Light from Uncommon Stars, I would say, of any book that I've read really recently, really sits right on the line between science fiction and fantasy, combining almost equal elements of both. There is a plot line, and one of the three protagonists is actually an alien. The action of the story takes place on Earth, but one of the protagonists is an alien who is disguised as a human and hiding out on Earth, running a donut shop, of all things. And then one of the protagonists is a young Asian American trans woman, and this is a book with trans representation written by a trans author, and it follows her journey. She's a skilled violinist, and the third protagonist has to find and deliver a number of souls to a demon in order to save her own soul. And so the soul that she intends to deliver as her final one is that of the young violinist, who's the protagonist that I just mentioned. This is a really unique book, and it deals with a lot of serious themes. It definitely grapples with misogyny and transphobia and xenophobia and violence and trauma. But the tone of this novel is somehow still gentle and almost lighthearted without trivializing any of the seriousness of the subject matter that it contains. It is so well written. I cannot wait to read more from Rika Aoki on the basis of this novel. I'm like, how did it take me almost a year from when it debuted to actually get to reading this? It's been on my list for a while, and I'm so glad that I did. So that's Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. Definitely recommend, whether you're a fan of science fiction or fantasy. It's a really interesting one, unlike anything you've ever read before, and so well written, and features multiple Asian characters who are women and or older, which was of course the prompt. The third prompt, again, was to read a book by an Asian author that has a universe that you would want to experience, or a universe that is totally different from yours. And this is definitely more of a universe totally different from yours pick. This is the most recent read for me. I just finished it yesterday. I chose Blackwater Sister by Zensho. Zensho is a Malaysian author. I have read one book by Zensho before. This is my second one. I liked this one better. This was really good. And Blackwater Sister was described by the author in a tweet as a stressed out lesbian fighting gods, gangsters, and grandmas in 21st century Penang, Malaysia. So, a lesbian fighting gods, gangsters, and grandmas. You know I'm going to put this book on my list, right? If you've followed my channel and know what books that I like, you will know that this would be one that is right on my alley. So it is set in a universe, right, that is a contemporary Earth, right? It is set in Malaysia, but in this novel, the main character is a young woman who has just moved back to Malaysia from America with her parents. She is grappling with not being out to her parents, being in a long-distance relationship with a partner who's in Singapore, and she's not sure what she's going to do with her life. She's just graduated from university, from Harvard, and her recently deceased grandmother starts to speak to her and effectively recruits her to, fight a battle that she had wanted to fight while she was alive. And hence, lesbian fighting gods, gangsters, and the grandma in her head. So again, this is also one that features an Asian character who's a woman and or older by an Asian author. And this was so good. This was so good. It was very action-packed. It was at times quite funny. It certainly captured the kind of complicated family dynamics and intergenerational dynamics, I thought, really well of a young person, going back to Malaysia with her parents, who had immigrated to America herself very, very, very young, and had spent her formative years in growing up in America, and is now living with extended family in Malaysia, and with complicated political dynamics around that, and complicated familial dynamics around that, in terms of some religious differences amongst the family and things like this, but with a focus on fighting gangsters and gods. And there's a real feminist tone to Blackwater Sister as well, not just because of the multiple female protagonists, but the ways in which it speaks to women's roles and experiences of sexism, I thought was really, really well done. So definitely recommend Blackwater Sister by Zen Cho. I had a really good reading month and a really good readathon experience. I'm going to recommend every book that I read, just so you know. So the fourth prompt was to read a book by an Asian author that has a cover worthy of googly eyes. Now, I only read one book that I can show you the cover because everything else was an ebook. And so I'm calling this the googly eyes cover book. And this was my most anticipated release, one of them, for 2022. It came out a couple of days after my birthday, and I picked it up, then a couple months ago. And that is The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories. And this is a collection of Chinese science fiction and fantasy in translation from a visionary team of female and non-binary creators. So, I like the colors on this cover. It has a floral, which you can see. It's a hardcover. I don't often spring for the hardcover, but this was really one that I was really looking forward to, and I knew that I would like. It has really nice marbled paper throughout, and I also like, this isn't exactly the cover, but it also has these kind of cover pages inside for each story, which I think is a really nice touch. It's a really nice book to have as a physical copy, so that's why I'm putting it for this prompt. But again, it could go with several of the others. And as the title suggests, it is a mix of science fiction and fantasy, short fiction in translation, and in amidst the short fiction, there are also some short essays here that are focused on gender representation in Chinese literature and Chinese publishing, as well as some discussions of Chinese to English and English to Chinese translation in sci-fi and fantasy in particular, and as relating to gendered language. And so there's some really interesting discussions in this book. I really enjoyed this essay called The Futures of Genders in Chinese Science Fiction by Jing Su. And this one had some really interesting questions. The author notes that the sci-fi genre moves in and out of truth and fantasy, the present and the future. For The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories, the first collection in English to exclusively feature women and non-binary authors of Chinese science fiction, questions about what distinguishes this volume and what it does would inevitably occur to the reader. For a kind of fiction that does not hold itself to reality as is, but instead aims for the unthought of what if, what can genre say about gender? How do we hold it accountable? And should we? And the author goes on to talk about the reception of Liu Cixin's three-body problem and the three-body trilogy, which is going to be made into a show for Netflix, actually, which I've read, and the global popularity of Chinese science fiction for big themes like space exploration, colonization, the enigmas of the universe, and so on. But not so much for spearheading social or progressive thinking specific to women or other marginalized genders. So it speaks to some of the criticisms of Liu Cixin's trilogy in terms of the female characters being kind of one-dimensional, and female and non-binary authors of Chinese science fiction not having gotten a lot of international or English language attention. And so really interesting, really interesting. And this, inevitably with an anthology, you're going to like some short stories more than others. I gave this one 4 stars. I really liked it. There were a lot of stories in here that I really liked that I would read again, and I'm happy to have this beautiful, googly eyes worthy hardcover book on my shelf. So, for it being one of my absolute most anticipated books of 2022, did not disappoint. So, googly eyes cover. The final book that I will mention is for the prompt, read a book by an Asian author that has a high rating or was highly recommended. And this is the only book on my list that is not in the sci-fi fantasy domain. For this one, I read the international and Korean bestseller, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, by Cho Nam-ju. And this is a book that has received much attention. It's award-winning. There's been a film made, which I would really like to see. And it is one that has been contentious for its depictions of Korean women's life experiences, and particularly experiences with sexism. It is called Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, because Kim Ji-young was the most common girl's name in that year in 1982. So it is intended to represent a kind of every woman in South Korea, and follows the protagonist Kim Ji-young, who becomes a mother and leaves a career. And this book was incredible, I thought. It is an incredible, to me, work of feminist fiction. And in exploring Kim Ji-young and other women's experiences with sexism in relationships, at home, in school, at work. What I think that this book does so well is to capture misogyny in its profound everydayness, its familiarity, its being followed on public transit, it's, being underestimated all the time. It's being belittled all the time. And the kinds of excuses that progressive people and progressive men make for it. And interspersed throughout the novel are some statistics about Korean society, particularly related to gender and to women's experiences in South Korea. So things like wage gaps. And as someone who's not Korean, who has never lived in Korea, who doesn't know a ton about Korea, I thought that this was really effective. It gave some context. And at the same time, Kim Ji-young's experiences felt very familiar to me. in her experiences of sexism at home and at work and in school. So this one I really, really highly recommend. I'm going to give this book to my mom. And I first heard about Kim Ji-young, born 1982, from Katie Flowers, who reviewed it on her channel as well, who, like me, also gave it 5 stars. So that's 2 recommendations for you for that book. And that is why I chose Kim Ji-young, born 1982, for Read a Book by an Asian author that has a high rating or was highly recommended. So that is the 5 books for Asian Readathon 2022 that I chose. I had a great time. I read all 4 and 5 star reads for me, and I encourage you to check out any and all of these books that are of interest to you. I'm looking forward to next year's Asian Readathon already. Thank you so much, Withcindy, for hosting and for coming up with these great prompts. If you have read any books this month, in particular for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, do share in the comments if you've read any of these books and you would like to share what you thought of them. Do let me know in the comments as well. You know, I love to chat about books. I'm apparently a tarot channel, but this month has very much been book filled. So it's been fun. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you all again soon.